Thanks for working through lunch. So this afternoon's session, which we're going to commence just in a moment with a screen presentation and then settle into a presentation from the table from the other speakers. And it started here 3 years ago when the whole issue of economic and social rights being placed into the Constitution was raised for the first time by a group of this kind, and it was raised within the Constitutional Convention. And as you will remember, in February 2014, the Constitutional Convention came out in a very strong statement and said that by 85% of the participants, that economic and social rights and cultural rights should be included in the Constitution so that they would become enforceable by law through the courts. And that would be a major breakthrough and a very important step forward for human rights and equality. It would provide a framework for an inclusive society. And the three pillars of that are being challenged in issues that we see in Irish society today. Economic rights, the right to work and to fair conditions of work, being challenged very recently by the Cleary's workers and the disgraceful way in which they were treated. The continuing presence in our economy of 0 hours contracts, and the Lewis dispute, which we were talking about, people being pilloried and demonised this morning. The Lewis workers have really got it in the neck in terms of media coverage of their dispute. And there's an upcoming one as well. Tesco, which recorded profits of 162 million here last year, is cutting wages. So economic rights on fair employment conditions is something that is very much under attack for those who are lucky enough to have work. On the issue of social rights, social security, education, health, basic standard of living and accommodation have been challenged in the last 12 months around the dreadful, not tragedy of Carrickmines. I'm sure David Joyce won't characterise it as a mere tragedy, but as something that is almost policy in terms of traveller accommodation and the cutbacks on that. The homeless crisis, which has become nothing short of barbaric. And the treatment of people with disabilities, where unemployment has gone up among people with disabilities from 8% to 22% in the last number of years. And there's the two-tier health system and the trolley crisis, which we're all more than aware of. On the issue of cultural rights, the right to participate in the culture of one's own community, and for ethnic minorities to have the right to practice their own culture, faith and language. And in that, I suppose a key one would have to be the refusal by Fine Gael to recognise traveller ethnicity in the last period, and indeed the rise of racism and Islamophobia. So the government ignored the important call that came from the Constitutional Convention and went with the minority position espoused by Michael McDowell very strongly within it, which was that it shouldn't be enforceable under the Constitution. It should be made up in policy by the Oireachtas as the Oireachtas goes along. So that was his position. It was outvoted by, as I said, 85%. And it wasn't only the Constitutional Convention, because you could say, well, they're just a hand-picked group of people. A Red C poll last year saw that this provision would be backed by 71% of the population as a whole. And the government took the wise or unwise, but certainly strange decision to not put this issue to a plebiscite, but instead to put the issue of abolition of the Seanad and the really key issue of whether you could run for president under the age of 35. Now that's something that we've all been waiting for change on. In his human rights lecture to FLAC in December, human rights lawyer Michael Farrell urged that economic, social and cultural rights be an election issue. It didn't become an election issue, but I think what did become an election issue was the fact that Irish people voted for a society rather than an economy. I think that was the message that went back. And I don't know if that message is going to be cherished if we have a return of a Fine Gael Labour government. That would be a strange outcome indeed, and that's what it's looking like at the moment. If you were to look for a basic charter for what a new government ought to try to achieve and enshrine in the Constitution, along with the various human rights conventions that have been ratified, what would those basic rights be? Michael in his lecture listed them as, and I think it's a very good list: the right to food, accommodation, adequate standard of living, social welfare, education, accessible healthcare, and gender and racial equality. And of course, if we include gender equality in that list, I think that one of the constitutional reforms will have to be repealing the Eighth Amendment to be included in that. So this afternoon we have three extremely qualified speakers on the issue. Aidan is going to speak first. He was one of the people who raised this whole issue within the Constitutional Convention and helped to convince those 85% that this was an issue that needed to be moved forward. His presentation is going to be on screen, so after that we will be at the table for the more formal session. So, Aidan Lloyd.